Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Sorry, we don't have any entry music for you all. Next time we will have some theme music.
It's very exciting, though, to see the participants filing in.
If you are able and willing, we would love for you to drop your organization in the chat. We're going to give folks another minute or two to join, and then we will get started. Wonderful to see some friends of organizations that we work with in other locations, so that's always really cool. And new friends as well. This is my best attempt at a radio voice. Okay, it's about 2 minutes after the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. We're so grateful that you have joined us from what we know is an incredibly busy time. And so, yes, great reminder in the chat. We would love for you all to chat to the whole group, so please do that. For the 60 minutes that we have today, we have at least 20 minutes available for Q&A. And so my colleagues will be watching the chat just in case there's any real-time clarification. And other than that, we'll do a ton of Q&A in the latter 20 minutes of today. So just as a reminder, this is part 1 of 2, and today is really about learning and inspiration. And in about 2 weeks, we're going to be rolling up our sleeves and doing some workshopping in real time. Okay, so let me just change my screen here. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm Ashley Burns-Nascimento, and my colleague is Mania Rivera, and we are principals at Rally Communications. And we're going to tell you a little bit about Rally before we dive in today. We both come from families who connectivity before someone starts sharing the thing is really important. And so one thing to know about our work at Rally is that we really are issue advocates, and that is a bit distinct from most comms organizations or PR firms, where we know that in order to drive long-term systemic change, it's really important to be working from the grassroots to the grass tops to cement policy change that allows for generations to take advantage of the hard work that we're all doing. So just to go into a little bit more, we wanted to just share that we work with organizations like you all, both deeply in specific states and across the country, bold and fearless leaders working for a better tomorrow. And so we're excited to be in great company. You'll see a lot of these tools show up throughout our case study conversation today, but this is just an example of the type of work that we do. And before we dig into the meat of today's case study, we're actually going to highlight 3 examples so you can just get to know us a little bit better, and then we'll dig into the topic of the day. So really quickly, some work that we did in Colorado with a health equity advocacy cohort. This was statewide work where we were crisscrossing the state, doing focus groups in rural and in some cases ultra-conservative communities, refugee resettlement communities, to help just this wide variety of folks who all believed that they deserved to live a healthy life, get to a single unified message and figure out what was the through line for everyone to be able to authentically carry a message in their communities to inspire everyday people to advocate for a healthy life. I could tell you some interesting stories about driving into a community and seeing certain signage on a barn that might make me feel unwelcome, but actually going in there and realizing that we had connective shared values that could move us all forward. Next is Protect ICWA. For those of you, maybe you saw this on, the evening news or in headlines, but this was really about protecting the Indian Child Welfare Act. And there was a challenge for the Supreme Court to overturn these protections for Native children who went into the welfare system. And spoiler alert, our work was so impactful, the Supreme Court voted 7-2 to uphold this. And it's important for you all to just have some context. This was work across policy, across legal, so litigation comms, and across communications to protect something that was so important. But before this moment, most people were unfamiliar with what this act was. And then Manny, do you want to speak a little bit about Ship at Zero and how it's relevant?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Manny Rivera here. Now, this Ship at Zero work is really, really interesting. It's in the climate and in the public health space. And the Ship at Zero campaign created a unified narrative to pressure large retailers to stop shipping dirty. Now, what's interesting here is that this was a narrative campaign with a bold message and various constituents that plugged into activations at different points along the way. That included coordinated protests, digital call-outs, media pressure, targeted advertising, and it was also a narrative change campaign that was meant to drive behavior change. And this is behavior change among corporate targets. So in the end, the work that was done here secured commitments from the likes of Amazon and IKEA to commit to zero emission shipping by 2040. So again, showing how public narrative change can lead to behavior change even among corporations. And I'm not saying here that corporations are people, not at all.
Okay, so now for the topic of today, our education footprint. So this is an example of our work and driving progress related to the attacks on education. Our experience in the ed sector is both, again, across the country and deep in states in red, purple, blue alike, and really working alongside coalitions and in many cases supporting parents and school leaders to navigate this really, really challenging climate. So what we're going to do today is really illuminate some examples from our experience that can help you all continue building on Nebraska's narrative change efforts. And we're really going to go deep into one example that demonstrates both the art and the science of what's possible and some tangible pathways to get there. So through the lens of this case study, we're going to unpack 4 core ingredients to successful narrative change, including coordination, message, the messengers, and channels. And I will just caveat that we are going to pack about 4+ years of work into about 40 minutes. So we're going to go deep in some spaces, and there's a lot of stuff we won't be able to share today, but we'll pull through into our next conversation. And so let's get into We Believe. Okay, so if you see here on this next slide, lots of, just really disturbing headlines. I'm sure you've seen them on national news, local headlines. What we're going to unpack for just a moment is how we even got there and how the nature of this crisis, how the nature of these attacks was entirely manufactured. And this is before folks who were a part of this started airing those details in outlets like The Atlantic and the New York Times. Okay, so you see this coverage timeline here. It starts in about September of 2020. I would love to go into great detail about everything that is here. We can certainly do that sometime. But what you really should take away from this is how it went from a nascent topic to exponential coverage after the insurrection. And this is in June 2021. And that was before most people were even paying attention to the attacks on education. And I'll go a little bit deeper here. So we were doing a research project at the time, and we saw these clusters of something that didn't make sense in terms of public education funding. So we dug deeper and there were 2,500 stories. I'm going to focus in on this blue line for a moment, which is like, what is CRT? And if you go into the next slide, here's where we can really start to see how this false narrative became ubiquitous. Traditional and social media really played a substantial role in scaling this false narrative. So in actuality, they gamed the algorithm. Now, again, remind you, this is mid 2021 where this data stops. And you can see here this blue topic of like what CRT is, which should be maybe neutral, maybe explain what's going on. But if you look at the top outlets, it's a bit of an eye chart, but you see the top publishers at this time, Fox News, Breitbart, the Federalist Papers, a bunch of outlets that essentially are not neutral, nor do they claim to be. And then you see this chart up here that this is social engagement. So how many times is it shared on Facebook? And this is in the tens of thousands. And then how many times is it published? And you see over here, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Florida, Idaho, and up here is the top Trump's 1776 commission, which was basically in response to the 1619 project. I'm sharing this to say, if you go into the next slide, early sentiment set the tone. Before most people were paying attention, all of these stories were incredibly negative, and it poisoned the water. So any person who maybe had heard something or wanted to find out what's going on, if you were to type into a search engine, what is this? These are the things that pop up because there's so many of them. And so I start with that because, as you'll see on this next slide, using the term CRT as an example was neither factual nor neutral. Creating fires and confusion was always a part of the strategy. And we have seen that in our work on a variety of topics, all the way from marriage equality to other campaigns in other countries. Like creating fires and confusion is always part of the strategy. And so knowing that, that is what contributes to coming up with ingredients to actually come up with both a successful campaign and to leverage strategies for narrative change that keeps this in mind. So I won't go into much detail on this slide, but I do want to point out something that maybe you already know, but perhaps you haven't seen this. This is how this tweet and this part of the movement, and this is again in 2021, is how CRT, which we know this was never about, DEI and SEL all got conflated. There was an intentional effort to conflate things, right? Create fires, create confusion. And that's how it came into the classroom. That's how it got to corporate DEI, putting that in the crosshair. Once they moved on from CRT, then these other things got put into the crosshairs. And so just wanted to name for folks, that's really how that conflation came about. The good news is disinformation poisoned the narrative, but it did not poison the values. We have continued to do focus groups, polling, all kinds of quantitative and qualitative studies, talking with superintendents and other folks across all races, all regions, all political backgrounds. Breaking through requires tapping into shared values because people's values were not poisoned. There's a smaller group of folks on the far right who have a certain opinion and they're very vocal, but about 85 to 95% of everyone else has some shared values. In this case, in terms of what they want for their kids, they want their kids to be successful. They want them to grow up and have opportunity. So tapping into shared values is a critical part of breaking through. And with that, my colleague Manny is going to talk more about coordination and messaging and messengers.
That's right. And so Ash talked about these four ingredients to narrative change. And across these four ingredients, the similar spice that goes across them, as Ash mentioned, is shared values. And coordination is crucial to narrative change campaigns because it ensures that all of our participants are aligned with a unified strategy to solve the challenge, which in turn amplifies a campaign's impact. We know that by coordinating efforts, organizations can avoid contradictory messages, They can make sure that the messaging in a campaign is not diluted and it remains effective. And they can pool resources so that we can have greater reach and influence. So coordination is critical. And that synergy that is created through coordination strengthens a campaign's both visibility and then also fosters the collaboration and the shared purpose that ultimately drives meaningful, sustained change. And this is what we want to do with narrative change. We want to make sure that it is sustained, and that's what we did. So if we go into the next slide, with the example of We Believe, which initially started as an initiative that we called Protect Schools, we are bringing together a core group of organizations that continued to expand as the campaign went forward. And with these organizations, we created alignment and an infrastructure that allowed for that synergy that I just talked about. These organizations that represented different constituencies, and many of them were also coming from different perspectives, but they were all committed to ensuring equity gains were not rolled back. They were all committed, again, sharing those shared values. And if we go to the next slide, one thing that comes with coordination comes the rise of an agreed upon strategy. And it usually follows this formula with narrative change campaigns. We want to sing from the same song sheet, meaning that we want to get aligned on messaging. We want to arm the field, which means getting resources like talking points, collateral to the field so that folks can use it and disseminate it and make sure that it is, again, ensuring that alignment. And when we do that, we can build a unified chorus that is singing from the same song sheet, and we can shift the narrative fight from defense to offense. And we'll get into how this coordination happens in our next training session next month. So this is, again, a little bit of an intro using this case study with We Believe. And then the next core ingredient here is messages. Now, with coordination, you have the folks that are aligned. Messaging is the vital ingredient that, again, threads that coordination, threads those different organizations, constituencies coming together. Messaging is vital to a narrative change campaign because it's the primary tool of communicating the campaign's goals, values, calls to action to our target audience. So here on this slide, messaging was especially critical here because, as Ash mentioned, the opposition had a head start. They used what's called moral panic as a political strategy to poison the narrative. And moral panic is when a committed but very, very vocal group expresses a view that they hold very, very strongly. And those who disagree with that view don't counter them. And so the loud voices continue to get louder, and there is a spiral of silence that happens among that silent majority. And we wanted to activate and arm this silent majority with the messages. So these are for the parents who saw the nonsense that the opposition was pushing. We wanted to arm them with the messaging that could help them reframe the conversation. And we did that by providing messaging and guidance. So for example, Ash mentioned CRT was one of the core things that the opposition was pushing. Instead, and the guidance that we shared with folks is that instead of correcting people that CRT is not being taught in schools, we wanted them to instead describe what an honest and inclusive education means and what is being banned in classrooms. Now, going to the next slide. This was a really, really interesting thing because while the opposition, again, had a head start, we go to the next slide, we started seeing a significant shift in public opinion by using this agreed upon messaging, this messaging that is the core component of narrative change. We started using this messaging and guidance and started seeing a change. So this is remarkable, and I want to spend a little bit of time here. Because in December 2021, we did some internal polling with Benenson Strategy Group. And that polling demonstrated that the narrative well, as Ash mentioned, was already very well poisoned. this number here is the one that I think gave us the biggest punch in the gut. Of the folks who had heard about the anti-equity laws that were being proposed, of the folks that had heard about these educational gag orders, a small majority supported these laws. Now, what made it worse is that the more folks had heard about the laws, the more they supported them. Now, let me repeat that. The more folks had heard about these laws, these anti-equity laws, the more they supported them. And that was across demographics. That included traditional progressive audiences. What this was telling us is that the loud other side was starting to win. And this is the result of moral panic. That spiral of silence was letting the other side win handedly. However, over the course of 9 months, when we started to get our act together, when we started to come together with message unity, we started seeing shifts and started seeing public polling moving decisively in our favor. And you can see that here, 18 points over 9 months. This is when we knew that we heard that we had hit the right message, that we were hitting the right notes. So in the next slide, with the right messaging, we activated that silent majority, that silent majority that was stuck previously in that spiral of silence. And the constituents that we felt were really critical to push back against this anti-equity backlash started waking up. And this shift, go to the next slide, is what gave us a path forward. So if we go, and this is when we can start talking a little bit about We Believe. This is when We Believe shifted from Protect Schools into a broader campaign effort. In 2021, we, along with our partners that we talked about earlier, realized that it wasn't enough to just have the messaging out in the field. It realized that it wasn't enough to just make sure that there was a coordination effort. We needed to make sure that there was an overarching messaging campaign and what we called national air cover to make that reframe possible. And because of our work at Rally across various issue areas, and especially in education, we understand how silos in the education sector can sometimes happen. And we knew that in order to have a successful movement, we needed to create a broader tent, one that welcomed and included individuals from various backgrounds, ideologies, perspectives. And so we developed a national campaign to both counter these false narratives and also provide a diverse and united front that was advocating for what parents and families actually want for our kids. So we're going to play here a short video to show you what this was about.
When we ban books,
we're really banning empathy, kindness, people's histories,
students' ability to pick up the skills they need for the 21st century.
Our kids deserve the freedom to learn.
Great. Now, if we can go to the next slide, this was the birth of We Believe. And We Believe was a campaign that was specifically designed to broaden the tent, designed to activate this silent majority and to push back on the book bans, on the anti-equity rhetoric, and to counter that false narrative with a positive shared aspiration that we believe in our children's freedom to learn. And going into the next slide, because we wanted to build national air cover, we also produced digital content that was white labeled. So that anyone could use, any partner could use. We created moments that coalesce partners around big pushes, and one of which Ash will talk about a bit later. And with these assets, go to the next slide, we were primed to build the next set of a core component of the narrative change campaign, which is to build a bench of prepared messengers that were going to be moving from defense to offense, messengers that could act as ambassadors representing the voice of this silent majority. And again, messengers are so crucial to a narrative change campaign because they embody the credibility, the relatability, and the authenticity of the campaign's message. And that's why they are a core ingredient to narrative change. So if we go into the next slide here, we know that the right messengers can bridge the gap between the campaign and our intended audience, making the message more persuasive and impactful. Whether they're influential public figures or respected members of the community or folks with compelling personal stories, the messengers lend their trustworthiness and their emotional resonance to the campaign, making the campaign connect with and mobilize the audience. And I love this, on this slide, that the messenger matters as much as the message is something that Ash likes to say a lot, and I love it, and I copy her and I repeat it because it is so true. You can have a solid message, but without the messenger that makes the most sense, it may fall flat into your audience's ears. So let's go to the next slide. So for messengers, these messengers, as they tapped into those shared values, they were able to bring parents along and inspire action. So the selection of these messengers was a strategic component of our campaign, and really a strategic component of any successful narrative change campaign. Now, in this next slide, we're going to show you a video. This video was delivered some messages, again, part of the We Believe campaign. And it's a little bit more focused towards folks that we call healthy skeptics, those folks that we wanted to engage. We're going to go ahead and play the video. And then I'd love for you all to just as it's a very, very, it's a short video, but I'd love for you all to share in the chat what you noticed about your video. So drop your comments in the chat. Let's go ahead and watch it.
What I see happening in America today goes against the very Constitution, goes against what we stand for as a country.
In the Navy, we have core value system: honor, courage, and commitment.
I think the one thing I learned most in the military is the sense of community and camaraderie.
There's also selfless service.
Diversity, equity, equality, highly American values, and I see those under attack every day in our school systems.
Banning books is insidiously dangerous. Learning America's true history makes our kids better citizens.
All right. So in the chat, drop in just for a couple of seconds here. What did you notice about this video? What did you notice in terms of the message that was being shared in the video? Just a couple of, love to see a couple of thoughts. Yes, this is military patriotism, the patriotic values. Yes, we had veterans that were a part of this. The speakers were all veterans. American values. You are all hitting it exactly in the head. And the reason here, this video, again, moving toward engaging those healthy skeptics, was specifically focused with messengers that could deliver the messages that we wanted to convey to more conservative, more patriotic. There was more of a focus on dads here, getting those dads engaged and involved, and having them think about the things that are being attacked in schools are the very same things that our military is teaching our troops about: the value of diversity, the value of supporting each other, the value of equity that we see and that makes our service members that much better. So this is an example of, again, using the right messengers as veterans themselves to compel and to convey a message that we could all agree on, a message that is rooted in values that we can all agree on, but that can be better received by the audience because of who the messengers are. So that's a really core component of, again, why messengers are such a core component of of a narrative change campaign. Now, if we go to the next slide, what's really beautiful in a successful narrative change effort is that you build out support and awareness, and you continue to engage and educate audiences, and they move along this engagement continuum, and ultimately messengers become ambassadors. And in our case, this silent majority began inspiring others in their orbit to start using the messaging and collateral in really interesting and helpful ways. So here, we had Jodi Picoult, who, as we were talking about book bans, came in and organically started raising up the same messages that we were pushing. We had this dad here who found some of the We Believe content and stickers and started putting them in his protest posters. But the idea here is when you are engaging the right messengers, they then engage additional constituents who then can grow and graduate into becoming messengers and ultimately ambassadors. And that's when you have a narrative change campaign that has the rocket fuel to not only maintain momentum, but to stick around for a bit. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ash to touch on the fourth component of successful narrative change campaign.
So I think often in this work, there's an instinct to either pitch an op-ed or reach out to a journalist directly. And part of why we want to go over a couple of different channels is because, especially given that this is an election year, it's important to really think broadly about how to reach the various audiences on the platforms that they're on. So before we go into platforms, let's talk a little bit about, channels. I'm using those interchangeably. But before we go in deeply, let's actually talk about audience segmentation. So we've used the term audience throughout this conversation, and I think it's really, really important to know that no audience is a monolith. There's no group of 100 people, even if they say we are all similar or we are all the same, they're gonna be at different stages on their journey towards being activated to move or change. So this audience segmentation map is a way to map out not only are your messages going to reach people in the right place on their journey and who are the messengers, but what are the channels? And so we've segmented this into engage, folks who we need to draw in, and then the latter side over here on the right is folks who are ready to be activated. So everything from starting with healthy skeptics all the way to, unbothered, and then folks who are already active and just need the instructions. I will, before we move on, just point out this category on the far left, which is denial and rejection. Messages aren't going to move those folks. A life change, a life circumstance, something else. But messaging, you could talk to some of those folks until you are blue in the face, and you could maybe move them slightly. And so this segmentation is to help us focus on who can we actually move. Healthy skepticism is a fine. Messaging can help move them, can help them think, can help them be curious. But the folks who are on the other side of that, generally comms aren't going to get them to move. But it's also important to understand most people are healthy skeptic and beyond. So it's just important to understand there is some segmentation science, if you will, to making sure that your messages will reach people based on where they are in their journey. And then if you look at this next slide here, this is where channels really start to come into play. So for folks who are in the engage category, where you really need to shift hearts and minds, we've got all of these different little icons down there in terms of how to reach them. It's about building awareness. You need messages that will build awareness. And then for the folks that are in the shift hearts category, you need messages that will educate. And then for shifting behaviors, you've got these other types of messaging, message types, and different types of channels that will reach them. So this is an architecture. You can kind of use this or think about this as a template. The main thing to really understand here is that, so for example, parents is our main audience. I have parents of young children, right? Parents of high school kids have a very different things going on in their head, very different amount of time. I'm still in the like, I don't get no sleep phase, right? So all audiences are going to be in different places about what they need and the channels to reach them. So that's really the main takeaway here. And then let's go into this nugget here, which is that traditional media isn't the only channel for change, and that informed public polling can really help stop media malpractice. There's certainly some aspirations, something, a positive North Star to work towards, but this is where public polling was really a key ingredient to help stop the media malpractice. So this is really about credibility, coordination, and collective action. So let's go into this one example. Using public polling that was intentionally framed using messages that we heard from communities, that we heard from parents that they value, that public polling was shared out with partners and used in reports and then released to the public in a way that really reputable traditional media outlets would be interested in picking it up. And then it got picked up by other non-traditional outlets on Instagram and other, non-traditional platforms where audiences even more broadly could have some data behind, oh yeah, this isn't what we want. And oh yeah, like I really do want these things for my kids so they can be successful both in the classroom and beyond, and really started to normalize what many folks believe to be true, but for so long had been drowned out by a vocal minority. And so this is just one example of being able to leverage data, shared values, putting it in the right places and the right channels to really gain not only credibility, but to scale the messages far and wide and give people some both courage and some camaraderie across the country and in specific regions to be able to stand up and say, this is not what we want, but here's what we do want. So this is an example of how using a wide variety of channels to reach a variety of audiences across generations and across communities really played out well. And then just to kind of round us out here, a couple things that we want to name, because as we are all deep in the work, doing really hard, exhausting work, and often don't take enough breaks to celebrate or frankly heal, we just wanted to point out that like there are so many wins in red, blue, and swing states. And those don't always get the media coverage, right? Because it's good news. So you're not always going to see that, but we like to share that with our friends and folks that we work with, that these things are winning. And there was a bit of an arc with the last set of public polling that was strategically dropped a month before the last November election. I think the polling was dropped in October. That's what I just showed you on the last slide. And the data was saying like, this is not what people want. And if you are advocating for this as a policymaker, we will not vote for you. And then a few weeks later on November 7th, people proved it. And many of those folks did not win. And the candidates who did win were people who were advocating for equity in schools and the things that we want for our kids. And so just wanted to lift up that there are wins in all kinds of communities, even where things have been really polarizing. And then last but not least here, this is where I just wanted to name, like, these are some good headlines. We saw lots of bad headlines for at least 2+ years. And you can see that the setbacks, the narrative was really starting to change. In contrast to that slide we started with up at the top with all of the really, really hard to read headlines, there are some really great headlines that have been surfacing because people showed up, they voted their values, and they had some, and the media, frankly, had some messages to draw from, because that's what people were saying in, that aligned with their experiences. So just before we head into the Q&A, a little bit of a recap. There are some core ingredients we covered in terms of contributing to successful narrative change, which is coordination, the message, which matters as much as the messengers, and the variety of channels to drive folks to positive change. And with that, we will move to Q&A. So I think the best way to do this, if there aren't any questions in the chat, I want to say raise hand function, and let's see if we can see if there are any hands raised. Or you're welcome to drop your question in the chat as well.
That's right. The Q&A box is also, oh, I think
Oh, I see some hands. Let's see.
Renee. Let's see, how do we?
Is it allowed to talk?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Could you both speak to, we have a bill in the legislature that's being heard next week that would ban DEI in our institutes of higher education. Would you have some advice for us about key messages that you suggest we really focus on? I know you touched on them, but we went through that slide pretty quick. So I wonder if you could revisit some of the do's and don'ts for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Renee. We'll pull up some of those slides in a moment with maybe a little bit of deeper tested messages and analysis, but there are a couple of things to remember. In the narrative architecture, we have found both testing it in qualitative, like focus groups, and then testing it in quant. It's always, always, always important to start with the aspiration. What are we after? What is the thing that we want? Because when you start there, it has the widest possible opening for people to come in. So in higher education and in corporations, et cetera, the values is that we want people to not only feel like they belong, but be set up for success in and be able to deal with the real world. There's a much more eloquent way of saying that, but really at the highest altitude, we have to be able to work with people who are different from us and lead all kinds of diverse groups. And in order to do that, it requires a learning environment that not only encourages that, but also allows people to learn in those contexts so that when they become working professionals, they can do that as well. So the architecture is really starting with the vision or the values. And then you move into what's at stake. What is the bill attempting to take away from what we know to be true that all young people need and believe? And then you move into the third ingredient is how do we move forward? What is it that we want to move? And then the call to action. So in a moment, I see some other questions in the chat. I'm going to go grab that slide for the narrative architecture, and then we can show folks what that is, including some of the messages.
You know, one thing that I'd love to just I can share here, and Ash is writing kind of dividing this messaging architecture into a way that's going to be more resonant with folks. And it really starts with especially when it comes to legislation that's being introduced that is harmful. We want to first start with aligning on shared values. So shared values, they start the conversation right from this place of agreement. Likely this place where we can all agree, right? And it could be aligning with the importance of families or invoking patriotism, but we want to align with shared values. The second thing is we want to then pivot to the impact, defining the impact, clearly outlining the consequences of the policies on our kids. And then the third step here is highlighting the benefits. So, you know, what does an inclusive education, what is our position How does our position support those initial shared values that you started with? And then the final part is the call to action. So what is it that we can do? What's the thing that can be done? Voting against the bill, or ensuring that certain language is included. What is that call to action that is going to create the change that you want to see, the policy change that you want to see? And actually, it's the slide that Ash has up for you.
So here's an example, Renee, of some of the elements of the message. And what we have found that folks do is they use parts of this and then customize it to their context. So for example, aligning with shared values. Maybe it's, in this case, it's not parents, but whoever it is that you're advocating on behalf of. We want kids, and in this case, if it's higher ed, maybe don't use the word kids, but students or young people, to feel safe and supported at schools, to have access to the resources they need to do X, Y, and Z. In this case, we were focused on mental health and well-being, which is obviously true, but that may not be the most pertinent thing. Sometimes it can be about having an environment where they feel like they're valued and they belong and they can actually learn. And then you've got some messaging here about defining the impact. Maybe you don't use extremist politicians. In some cases, people need to use that. In other cases, it's actually not helpful if they do. And so, whether it's extremists or whether it's certain people, you can find and replace a little bit of this messaging here and change the audience. But there are folks who are pushing policies and agendas that don't allow students to do X, Y, and Z. And frankly, this piece about denying students life skills is really, really critical. That is what so many of these bills actually do. We know that they're rolling back child labor laws, so kids don't go to school and they go to work. Like it's really unreal. But they're denying students the life skills that they need to actually go on and be successful outside of school. You see these benefits about being better prepared for success, having a happier, healthier, more successful lifestyle, being good citizens, being prepared to contribute, and then the call to action, like Manny said, if you're advocating, like at this point, you want people to not vote for a certain policy or do vote for a certain policy, this is where you would bring that in. So I'm gonna stop share because I think there's some other things we'll probably pull up.
See that there's a question around the fourth item on that last slide. So that was of the 4 components to successful narrative change campaign. It's that fourth item was channels. Coordination, message, messengers, and channel. And we'll be going in a little bit deeper as we work together in our next session around how we can identify those how we can identify those different components that are specific to what you're trying to accomplish in our next sessions.
Here's just one more quick example and why naming the collective benefit is important. Sometimes you only have 36 to land a message. It's really important to avoid the zero-sum game and talk about supporting every kid in all communities and how our country benefits. For example, so this soundbite here, we know our kids must learn to work together to be successful outside the classroom. And this starts by teaching them all about the diverse people and communities who contribute to our country and school. That's just one example of connecting what happens to individual young people and how it contributes to our broader society, broader community, broader state. And then you said do's and don'ts, and it made me think of this here. A couple of do's and don'ts to really anchor on: demonstrate what's possible, do everything you can to use plain language, lift up life skills like empathy, curiosity, and then highlight the importance of students feeling valued, accepted, and celebrated. And then here are some don'ts, like really avoid getting trapped in a debate. Don't assume others have the same definition of jargon, and try to avoid feeding into cynicism by only focusing on problems. That's natural when someone brings a problem to you and you want to combat it or debate it, but actually we can spend a lot of our energy on that debate or combating and then never actually get to the aspiration and what we want.
Want to the question from Tammy on the resources that are available to volunteer groups. We do have some resources, and we are hoping to also just share those out with our next session. High-level resources that could be very helpful. So the do's and don'ts that Ash just shared are, really good example of that. We also have some guidance on language that should be used. So for example, we know that the word equity has been turned into a dirty word by the opposition. So instead of using the word, we encourage folks to describe equity instead of naming it. So Ash also says, I love Ashisms. I just repeat them all the time. But it's changing the words, not the work, in order to make it easier to continue doing the work. So describe equity rather than naming it, or describe diversity rather than naming it, because again, the opposition has done a really good job at poisoning some of that language. So we'll be sure to share that with you, especially as we continue these conversations.
Mhm.
And Ash, you want to take Rebecca's question?
Yeah, and let me just add one more thing and change the words, not the work. This is not about being duplicitous. This is about listening to folks and understanding that there's maybe something cemented in their mind that was incorrect, like disinformation. And so what we heard in focus groups, which was both like exciting and slightly infuriating, is when you explain equity. So for example, that all kids have unique needs and schools should be able to be resourced to meet those unique needs. People were, yes, absolutely, 1,000% agree. That is in essence what equity is, what equity stands to do. It understands that all of us are different. We have different needs for various reasons, and a public system that we pay taxes into should be able to support us because we are all worthy of a public education. And so that's just one example of when you describe it, people aren't triggered. But when you use the jargon that happens to be commonplace in this season of our generation, then it might send someone to an unhelpful place. So if you're in a context where there are words that are triggering or misunderstood, you can actually just describe it in a pithy way, and often you break through. So I wanted to give some context, like where that came from. Lots of focus groups, lots of message testing, and it was like, oh, people still agree with this. They just don't like this particular frame. Okay, fine. Like, we don't have to use that. Okay, Rebecca, great question. What does this look like on a state level to get a different group singing from the same songbook? So there's a couple things, and this is actually part of what we'll start to tackle in the second workshop. It really requires a shared understanding first of what are we solving for and where are we going. I start there because when people are unified in, oh, this is what we're all working to solve together, and we give people permission to, like, just take the choir analogy as an example, there's altos, sopranos, tenors, bass, etc. Everybody needs to be able to sing in their vocal range that works for them and their body. But we're all still singing the same song, and it's actually beautiful and better when we are singing the tone that works for us. And so having a shared unified message means the message umbrella is broad enough that a bunch of us can come under the umbrella, but to mix metaphors a little bit, like a beach ball, right? Umbrellas have different panels, and each panel is going to have its own part. And so you've got to have a message that's high level enough that folks can agree on, and you give people the permission, or maybe they need to give themselves permission. Like, the way Manny says a thing is not going to be the way I say a thing, but when we are speaking in alignment, it can work for a variety of audiences. So, in broad strokes, the steps are making sure there's shared agreement on what are we solving for, And two, where do we want to go? And then you work on the pathways to get there that allow a variety of people in different communities, different lived experiences, to get in the same songbook, if you will.
And
So
that's
we'll
why
start
that,
that in 2 weeks.
yeah. And that's why that coordination piece is really, really so critical, really fundamental to developing a narrative change campaign is we need to go through those steps as part of the coordination. And at the end of that, right, at the end of that alignment, the strategy starts bubbling up. And then that's when we can start kind of plugging in the messages, the messengers, and the channels. Great. Any other questions that we may have missed? I think we got the ones in the chat, but if folks raise their hands and we missed it, please let us know. Tammy's question. Yes. So Tammy, we do have those resources. We have some resources that we will share with you. Again, a lot of those resources are rooted in some of the research and polling that we've done nationally. This is where I'm gonna share this one slide because I thought it was it's one of the, just going back to the word equity. Let's see, how do I do this? The resources that we have are rooted, again, they're rooted in national audiences, but again, could be customized to an extent for local communities. We're not saying that, we obviously want to make sure that we're keeping the audience in mind. But this is, I think, an example of the type of guidance that can be provided, right? So hopefully you can see this here. This is where, the note that we were sharing with you all about defining equity rather than saying it, this is the data that backs that up, right? It's showing here the two different options that were shared with the folks that were surveyed here. You can see that when the word equitably is used, you really don't see a significant bump, even among our base, even among persuadables, right? But when you define the word equity rather than using it, you see significant bumps from our base. So this would be folks that are more on the progressive side, the persuadable. So this is the movable middle. And among the opposition, the folks that we're never going to get, it's still not a great number. But this is when we're creating a narrative change campaign. These are the folks who we want to focus on, right? The ones that are going to be pushing back against this is the silent majority that we want to push back against the opposition's misinformation. I'm going to stop sharing now because I think a couple questions came in.
I'm just answering some in the chat. And yes, there is a recording and there will be some instructions on how to access that. I don't know, Renee or anyone else from the team, do you want to share more on that front, or will that just come via email?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, we will, I think we will be sharing those out with the folks who registered, and I think can provide that to folks who, there are some people who indicated that they wouldn't be able to attend, but wanted to watch the recording. We don't want to distribute it far and wide though, so it won't be available to the entire NAM listserv, for example, but Tammy, we can make sure that you are getting that recording.
Well, thank you all so much for your time and attention and great questions. We're so excited to be supporting you all as a resource and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks on February 23rd, same time, same place. And let us know what thoughts or questions you have in the meantime. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.